For the past 10 years, the Louis Burke Frumkes Center for Writing and Culture at Hunter College has presented free talks for the public by best-selling authors and great thinkers on the college's Upper East Side campus. This unique opportunity to meet exceptional individuals in an intimate setting with light refreshments has drawn guests from within and beyond New York City.
Hi, did you enjoy it?
Those of you who are writers know what I'm talking about. You have a little voice in your head, drives you crazy.
We're dancing with words, prancing with words.
As a result of the 2020 coronavirus pandemic and required social distancing, public gatherings such as our remaining 2 talks for the spring semester have unfortunately been canceled.
That was a wonderful, wonderful talk. Thank goodness we've recorded it.
Center Director Louis Frumkes has had each of the talks recorded for archives and to provide a copy of the talk to the speaker on DVD. The lectures were not intended to be made available online.
We have some incredible scientists coming.
That the universe just began.
Given the need for intellectual stimulation during this troubling time, the Frumkes Center is making many of our past talks available to view for a limited time each week, starting with the first recorded talk featuring Howard Gardner back in April of 2011, running through our most recent talk on March 9th, 2020 with Meg Wolitzer. Stay tuned to our website for more information about the videos available each week.
Good evening, good evening. Oh, this is the proper distance. Thank you all for coming. My name is Louis Frumkes. I'm the director of the Writing Center. And on your seats you probably found a brochure about our program and an early flyer. The brochures for the Writers' Conference are at the printer now, but you've probably will see a flyer there about our Writers' Conference on June 4th. We put those there on the off chance that some of you may be interested in writing, and we want to believe that we are putting on a really spectacular Writers' Conference, the first one on Saturday, June 4th here at Hunter. It's the first Hunter Writers' Conference. In any event, tonight is a very special evening because in addition to this being my first year here, I've run the Writers' Conference and Best-Selling Authors series before at another college, but this is our first year with what we are calling the Great Thinkers of Our Time series of talks and lectures. And those of you who have been here may remember that we had Carol Gilligan here, and we had Frank Wilczek, and about a week ago we had Howard Gardner. And tonight we are very, very fortunate to have Freeman Dyson. And I am going to, hi Bob, and I'm going to give you a brief, it's not so brief actually, maybe my introduction may be longer than his talk, but I've written out a little intro just to give you tell you a little something about Freeman, and then he'll come up and give you his talk on 4 revolutions in science. I first met Freeman Dyson in the 1990s when, after having read Disturbing the Universe, I approached him after a talk he gave at the Harmony Club and invited him to be a guest on my radio show. He replied that I should email him with my request. But I don't know how to do email, I implored, gamely but lamely. Learn, said Freeman, so I did. And Freeman generously came to my home where I taped a fascinating interview for my show, and he corrected every other word I said because, as I'm sure he will do tonight as well, but that's okay because Freeman is surely one of the giants of our time, and I forgive him for being interested in precision. Ed Regis, in his book, Who Got Einstein's Office, once said of Freeman Dyson has probably the most fertile imagination of anyone who's ever been at the Institute, bar nobody. Ideas, schemes, plots just come pouring out of his head, not only about elementary particles, stars, galaxies, but about everything. Consider that he once proposed reprogramming a turtle's DNA so that it would grow diamond-tipped teeth, and fleets of these diamond-toothed tortoises would be sent waddling up and down America's highways to eat up tin cans, bottles, and empty hamburger wrappers. Around 1955, when Stanislaus Ulam, you may remember him, he was the mathematician that enabled Teller to create the the hydrogen bomb. Ulam was a brilliant Polish mathematician. I once interviewed Edward Teller and asked him about Ulam. He said, I don't want to talk about Ulam. Ulam had died 2 years ago, and clearly Teller wanted to keep him buried. But in any event, around 1955, when Stanislaus Ulam and his friend C.J. Everett had written a paper about a spaceship propelled by successive thermonuclear bomb explosions that would blast its way through the heavens by setting off the H-bombs behind it and riding the force of their shock waves, Freeman was ready to sign on and pilot the ship of the plan which became known as Project Orion. Correct me if I'm wrong, Freeman. Richard Courant, the great mathematician, the eponymous name behind the Courant Institute, commented in his German accent at that time, "This is nuts. This is super nuts." Anyway, Freeman Dyson is, in addition to being funny, adventurous, brilliantly original, with a mind that probably resembles the step mankind will take in its next evolution forward, one of our iconic figures in science. He is a physicist and mathematician who, as a youngster, was promoted to full professor by J. Robert Oppenheimer without having to finish a PhD, simply because of his uncanny mental abilities, and who worked with Feynman and Bethe and Teller, and who importantly recognized the fact that Feynman and Julian Schwinger and Shinichiro Tomonaka were all seeing the same idea from different points of view, and that if you put them together you would have a full-fledged theory of quantum electrodynamics, which resulted in the three of them being awarded the Nobel Prize in Physics. Many people thought that Freeman should have been included in that prize, but he wasn't, and in his immense modesty never makes claims for himself and seems to stand aside and just do what he likes to do best at the Institute for Advanced Studies at Princeton: think and write books and change the world for the better. Of course, he has won many prizes, such as the Wolf Prize, the Planck Medal, the Heinemann Prize, the Fermi Prize, and many others, so he is not exactly neglected in that world. In any event, it gives me great pleasure to present Freeman Dyson here at Hunter as the finale of our Great Thinkers series. Freeman? And after he finishes his talk, I will come up, and Freeman has agreed to take some questions. Then he will sign some books in the back, and there are refreshments for all of you.
Good. Well, I have two talks prepared. First, a written scholarly talk, the kind that you give to gatherings of elderly philosophers, and second, extemporaneous talk, which I gave recently in California. So I'll give you a little of both, just for fun. Here is the philosophical script, which is called "Is Science Close to Its Limits?" So I'll give you 5 minutes of that and the rest of the time for talk. So recently I heard a talk by George Steiner, a famous literary scholar, with the title, "Is Science Nearing Its Limits?" He answered the question with a resounding yes. His view of science can be summarized.
I'm just going, someone said it was hard to see if this works a little better.
Good. His view of science can be summarized in one sentence. Science was a passing phase of human culture and is now, fortunately, over. He painted a picture of science as an institution in an advanced state of decline. Year after year, decade after decade, the input of money into scientific research increases, while the output of important discoveries decreases. Constantly increasing numbers of researchers are pursuing problems that are of interest to diminishing numbers of people. Scientists are increasingly isolated in specialized compartments, unable to communicate with each other or with the society to which they belong. While science proliferates into esoteric specialties of little practical relevance, the society which used to look to science for guidance now relies instead on astrology and superstition. Professional astrologers now outnumber professional astronomers by 5 to 1, and popular books on mysticism and magic outnumber popular books on science by 10 to 1. Steiner's picture of science in decline reminds me in many ways of Otto Spengler's Untergang des Abendlandes, the decline of the West, an apocalyptic description of the collapse of Western civilization, published in Munich in July 1918, just as the First World War was ending with the collapse of Germany. Spengler had been a student of physics before he became a historian. He devoted many of his pages to the state of science and technology as he saw it in 1918. He wrote with expert knowledge and awareness of the crisis in classical physics that began in 1900 with Max Planck's postulate of the quantum and came to a climax in 1916 with Einstein's publication of the theory of general relativity. So now I quote from Spengler. "Western European physics has reached the limits of its possibilities. This is the origin of the sudden and annihilating doubt that has arisen about things that even yesterday were the unchallenged foundation of physical theory, about the meaning of the energy principle, the concepts of mass, space, absolute time, and causal natural laws generally." Spengler was a master of style as well as historical erudition. His great work went through 60 editions in 8 years after 1918. It was read by almost everybody in the German-speaking literary world, and also by most of the leading German-speaking scientists. Spengler's literary brilliance convinced them that classical physics had reached a dead end, and the only way ahead was a radical revolution. It turned out, as we now know, that Spengler was right. 7 years after his book was published, there was a radical revolution in physics. Heisenberg discovered the true limits of causality in atomic processes. This revolution did what Spengler had predicted. Heisenberg's quantum mechanics demolished the grand edifice of classical physics as it had existed in the 19th century. But after the revolution was over, things did not continue to happen as Spengler had expected. Quantum mechanics was not the end of physics. Instead of the inexorable decline that Spengler had imagined, the revolution led to a new golden age. After quantum mechanics, physics and chemistry flourished as never before, with theory and experiment racing ahead to explain and verify the finest details of atoms and molecules. The revolution was not an ending, but a new beginning. The generation of physicists that grew up after the revolution did not read Spengler. That generation had lived through the decline of the West and survived it. They were still alive after living through 2 world wars and many other catastrophes. They were engaged in rebuilding Western civilization from the wreckage of the wars, and they saw science still stretching ahead of them as an endless frontier. That generation happens to be mine. So that's enough of the scholarly script. So I want then to talk about actually what happened in the next 70 years after that. So I start with 1945, when I was just enormously lucky, first of all, to survive the war. We all felt tremendously lucky, of course, those of us who did survive. And in addition to that, to be present at the creation just when 4 simultaneous major revolutions were happening. The 4 revolutions were space, nuclear, genomes, and computers, all 4 of them just taking off in 1945. So that's what I'm going to talk about. So 1945 was actually 1 year later. It really happened in 1944. In London, we noticed that things were falling down out of the sky around our heads, and things called V2s, which were the first spacecraft, in fact, designed by our friend Werner von Braun in Peenemünde. And so they began falling in London, and these were the most benign forms of bombardment you can imagine. It was a delight because every time you heard one of them go bang, and then there would be a whine when you'd hear the supersonic trajectory of the rocket coming down after the bang. So you know that it missed you and you didn't have to worry. Whereas conventional bombs, of course, are much less pleasant because you hear them before they fall. So anyhow, so we were enjoying this bombardment and in fact calculating that this was a marvelous way of unilaterally disarming Germany, that every one of those rockets we could calculate would cost the Germans just about as much as a high-performance fighter aircraft, which the Germans desperately needed, and not to mention bomber aircraft, which they didn't bother with much. But instead, they were wasting their money on these stupid rockets. And so we were very happy with that, too. And it's interesting, I read afterwards the memoirs of von Braun, that actually Hitler, in fact, was quite aware of the problem, that he knew the whole thing didn't make sense. And von Braun talked with Hitler, I think in 1943, when the first A4, the Germans called it A4, when the first A4s were tested over the Baltic, Hitler came and talked with von Braun about the program, and von Braun told him very proudly how wonderful it was they had these rockets, and Hitler said, but these are only artillery. What else can they do? All they do is shoot like big artillery guns, and you don't have enough. They're not going to do any good. And so Hitler said, how many do you have? And von Braun said, oh, but with luck we'll have about 10,000 by next year. And Hitler said, that's no good. If it's artillery, you need 1 million. So can you give me 1 million? And von Braun said, oh, yes, mein Führer, yes. And the conversation came to an end. So Hitler had the impression there were going to be 1 million of these things, but he never checked. And of course, in fact, von Braun never, in fact, built more than he originally intended, which was about 10,000. There was no way they could have built 1 million. They're just too damned expensive. So, I mean, Hitler was he was not stupid, but he was just negligent. And so we were very lucky. Anyhow, so then a year later, Arthur Clarke in England invented communication satellites, which was the first practical use of space, which really started things going in a practical way. And Arthur Clarke, of course, also wrote a lot of very fine science fiction, and he was one of the driving forces of the space revolution. From the beginning, there were sort of two aspects of space which sit uneasily together. There's space as exploring the universe, actually doing science, and there is space for fun, that is, as an international sporting event. And those two ways of doing space, I think they're both equally important, actually. I love both of them, but it's very bad to mix them up because they need different tools and different kinds of missions. So it's turned out that the science program, of course, needs instruments and does not need humans in space. It goes ahead beautifully without humans, and we've learned as the years go by to build instruments that do the exploring for us very, very much more efficiently and more cheaply, and without endangering lives. Meanwhile, the manned space program in the last 50 years has fallen into the doldrums. It started out beautifully with the Apollo program, which was both science and an international sporting event, but mostly a sporting event. And that was splendid because the whole country was enthusiastic about it, and the getting to the moon was in fact a great adventure, and everybody could share it. I think, I mean, The thing which to me was astonishing was not getting to the moon. We'd expected to get to the moon earlier than that. In fact, it took an awful long time. But what was the real surprise was that they had the television cameras there ready when the first Armstrong and Aldrin walked down the ladder to the ground. Television cameras were there, and we actually saw it happen. That was a brilliant part of the mission, which of course made it a public event, and certainly something we had not expected. Anyhow, I should watch the time. I have about 40 minutes, and I wanted to talk about 4 revolutions. So while the Apollo was going on, we had our competing program, which was Orion, which Crumkes actually mentioned in his introduction. Orion was this splendid scheme for flying a spacecraft with nuclear bombs to drive it along. And this was another, just like the V2, it was a marvelous form of unilateral disarmament. But in this case, it was intentional. That the whole point of Orion was actually to get rid of nuclear weapons in a benign way without killing people. It was the only way of doing that I've ever come across, that actually did get rid of them in huge numbers. Every mission of Orion going to Mars or to one of the satellites of Saturn, one of the places we really wanted to go to was Enceladus, which was quite astonishing because we didn't know anything about Enceladus in those days. It turns out it's about the most exciting place in the solar system. It's an ice ball with very strange hot jets streaming out of the South Pole, and nobody understands how that could happen. So it would be a wonderful place to explore. So that was one of the places we planned to visit. And anyway, each mission carried 2,000 bombs. So we hoped, in fact, to have a tacit agreement or even perhaps an official agreement with the Soviet Union, as they would like to do it too, so we'd get rid of their bombs as well as ours. And it would have been a great achievement. However, the world didn't go that way, and maybe it's just as well. In the meantime, Linus Pauling began calling attention to the nuclear fallout as a big problem, and he got the Nobel Prize for Peace as well as the Nobel Prize for Chemistry. And he earned both. He was a great man in many ways, and he was right about the fallout. It was, in fact, we were exploding bombs in the atmosphere at that time, the Russians and we, at an unconscionable rate. And we were making the whole Earth radioactive as a result. And so there was a drive to ban nuclear tests in the atmosphere, which resulted in a treaty. So in 1963, I happened to be at the Disarmament Agency in Washington, which was a lovely place to work at that time. So we were the sort of the part of the government dedicated to peace as opposed to the Defense Department, which was devoted to war. And at that time, we actually had some political clout, which unfortunately the Disarmament Agency no longer has. But in those days, we did count for something. So anyway, I had to make the choice. I was there at the Disarmament Agency helping to negotiate the test ban, and I was also still involved with the Orion project, and which would be it would be totally outlawed if the test ban came into force. So I had to make the choice in a very direct way, and the choice was obvious, in fact. So I went and testified in the Senate hearings and in favor of the test ban, and I was very happy it passed. It actually got ratified very, very quickly. That was a marvelous summer. It was August 1963, while I was at the Disarmament Agency, and I went marching with Martin Luther King, and that was a marvelous summer. All kinds of good things were happening. And I was actually standing quite close to King when he gave his famous speech. And I wrote home to my mother that evening, I'd go to jail for that fellow any time. But didn't come to that. Anyway, so that's enough about space. The shuttle, of course, tried to be both freight and passengers. The railroads discovered long ago that it was better to have separate trains for passengers and freight. The shuttle tried to do both, and that was the main reason why it failed. So it was, in fact, a white elephant. It became the sort of universal vehicle that was supposed to do everything, and it did a lot of good things, but it was grossly cost ineffective as far as it just gave too little for the money it cost. Each shuttle mission cost about $500 million, and an unmanned vehicle with the same payload, of course, could cost a lot less. Well, let's get on to the next. Nuclear. So, 45, we had Hiroshima. And of course, I, like everybody else at that time, thought that Hiroshima ended World War II. That was a universal belief. It was obvious. The bombs fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The war came to an end. Obviously, that's what did it. Well, we now know that that's not so. And I have a friend in Princeton, Ward Wilson, who is writing a book about this, and he's done very careful research to find out what really happened in Japan during that week after the bombs were dropped. And it's very clear from the evidence of the actual meetings as they happened and the testimony of the various people involved that it was actually not the bombs that caused the end of the war. And I think it's important to be aware of that, because that was the only case where you might say the bombs actually did some good. But in fact, it ain't so. They did kill a lot of people, but they did not end the war. So let me just tell you one piece of evidence which I think is most striking. The Emperor Hirohito had a problem. He had to make his troops actually surrender. And that was never been, it was not in their tradition. They had this very, very strong tradition of never giving up, of fighting to the last man. And so he had to make sure that those soldiers would really surrender when he told them to. And so he gave them an order, and you can read the order. It's a written order, and you can actually read what he said. And it says not a word about the bombs. What it talks about is history. It is the history of what his grandfather did. His grandfather was the great emperor Meiji, who modernized Japan. So everybody had the highest respect for Meiji. He was sort of the best emperor they ever had in many ways. And well, what did Meiji do in 1895? He surrendered to the Europeans in a humiliating fashion. And the way it happened was that in 1895 there was the first war between Japan and China, which Japan won. So Japan defeated the Chinese and moved into Manchuria, which had been Chinese. So the Japanese briefly occupied Manchuria. But then the European powers intervened, led by Russia, including Germany and France and England. And so the European powers told the Japanese, no, you can't do that, and get out of Manchuria. And Meiji decided to surrender in the most humiliating fashion and keep the Russians out of Japan. That was the point, that the Russians got Manchuria, but they did not get Japan. So that was what Meiji achieved by surrendering in 1895, and so that Hirohito in 1945 said, that's exactly what we're doing now. We have to surrender, but we'll keep the Russians out of Japan. And that's what happened. Anyhow, so it was the Soviet invasion, in fact, which caused the war to come to an end. So the Japanese knew that they couldn't defend Japan from the Americans in the south and the Russians in the north. And if they tried to fight the war on two fronts, the Russians were going to end up occupying at least half of Japan. So anyway, that's the beginning of the nuclear age. Then the problem we've had ever since is, how do you get rid of the bombs? And we've made various attempts. Of course, the test ban was a big step, but it didn't actually get rid of any bombs. It did have a very good, it had a very good effect, which it limited the size of bombs that you could actually test. The biggest thing you can test underground is about 10 megatons. So after, at least it stopped the race to going to bigger and bigger bombs, which had been going on before that. And actually the bombs got smaller as a result. Well, let me talk a bit about nuclear power, because that was also part of the nuclear revolution. Nuclear energy gave us bombs, and it gave us also power stations and reactors of all sorts. Well, I got involved in this in 1956, working on a commercial reactor, not to produce electricity, but to produce isotopes for medical diagnosis. For medical diagnosis, it's extremely helpful to have very short-lived isotopes, because you want something you put into a person, and you can measure the activity, and it tells you what's going on inside, but it's all gone in a few hours, so it has no lasting health effects. So it's very important to have short-lived isotopes. And so there are many hospitals all over the world which actually have these reactors to produce short-lived isotopes. So we designed a reactor, and our leader in this enterprise was Edward Teller, the same guy who had built the hydrogen bomb. He was also a fanatic. He was not only a fanatic about bombs, he was also a fanatic about safe reactors. And in fact, he had exactly the right idea. He always said right from the beginning, if you want to do nuclear reactors, absolutely the first and essential thing is to make them safe. And by safe, he had very high standards. He said the definition of safe is you give this thing to a bunch of high school kids, and there's no way they can get hurt. And that was the definition. So we designed our reactor to be safe in that sense. So it meant, in fact, that you could think of the worst possible accident, which is you take it from a cold start, which means the nuclear reactivity is the highest. It's the worst situation you can be in. So you have the reactor cold and shut down, and then you pull out all the control rods explosively as fast as you possibly can in a fraction of a second. So the thing goes prompt critical. That means it's actually exploding like a bomb. And it shuts itself off in a millisecond without any human intervention, and nothing bad happens. So we tested it just exactly that way, 1,000 times over, to make sure that nothing bad would happen. And did that 1,000 times before we sold the first one. And of course, that's what should have happened to the entire industry. That if that had been the way they went, it would have worked. Now, of course, the Japanese are paying the penalty for not doing it that way. And I won't give you a lecture about nuclear reactors, but it is possible to build them safe. We did that. And so we built 75 of this reactor. It's called the Triga. And none of them have ever given any trouble. Quite a lot of them are still running. That's 55 years ago. And we just built them safe. That was it. And in fact, one of the nicest things about that was we got Niels Bohr, who was the father of the nuclear business. He's the great physicist. Came over all the way from Denmark to California, actually to pull out the control rods for one of these safety trials in public. And so he gave the thing his official blessing, which was great fun. Well, anyway, next. So how about getting rid of the weapons? There are two ways of doing that. You can try to negotiate a treaty, and lots of people have tried that, and it's very, very, very slow. I mean, because the test ban actually worked. And the reason is it's very short, it's very simple. And Averell Harriman was the negotiator who was negotiating the treaty in Moscow. And we in Washington we sent him a message saying, would you like some scientists to help? And he sent a message back saying, no, to keep the scientists away if you want to have a treaty. And he was right. I mean, the point, if the scientists had been there, we would have found all sorts of loopholes, I'm sure. And science loves to make things more complicated. So he wanted a short, simple treaty, and that's what he got. Anyhow, after that, we've tried many times to make more treaties, and it's painfully slow because you have to negotiate at the same time with the Russians or whoever it is whom you consider to be your enemies, and also you have to negotiate with the Senate at the same time, and it's very, very hard, and to make any progress is very, very slow. And so I'm actually very strongly of the opinion that if you want to abolish nuclear weapons, the way to do it is unilaterally, and that's the way it will be done, that's the way it should be done. And there are some examples. Well, first of all, President Nixon did that with biological weapons. He did not try to negotiate a treaty. He simply, one afternoon, he said, we're getting rid of all our biological weapons, all the research labs are going to be open, we're going to have zero stockpiles. And it was all done in one afternoon before political opposition could develop. Nobody needed to ratify it. And that's what a president can actually do if he's a right-wing Republican. And of course, it helps enormously to be a right-wing Republican. And I think that it was, in that case, it was certainly the reason why it worked so well. Well, there's another example of the same thing with nuclear weapons. That was George Bush Sr. One day in 1991, he got rid of more than half of our nuclear weapons. And he was very clever. He did it on the same day that the tobacco industry came to a settlement with a big class action lawsuit of people who claimed to have got cancer from smoking cigarettes. And this settlement of the tobacco case took all the headlines. And Bush getting rid of the nukes was somewhere on page 7. But it worked. He got rid of all our tactical nuclear weapons in the Army and in the Surface Navy, which turned out to be more than half of the total. And that was enormously important because those actually were the most dangerous weapons. They were deployed all over the world in stupid places. And the Army didn't like them. The Army was very happy to be rid of them, in fact, and so was the Surface Navy. The Surface Navy was another very dangerous situation. I went on board the missile cruiser Princeton and when they were carrying nuclear cruise missiles and non-nuclear cruise missiles. They had 49 nuclear and 49 non-nuclear, so the captain had to be very careful to remember which was which. And anyhow, I mean, it was an accident waiting to happen, and so fortunately they got rid of those. And anyway, so George Bush Sr., of course, also had the advantage of being a right-wing Republican. So that almost was sufficient consideration for me to vote for McCain, but not quite. And anyhow, I have to go ahead fast. Genomes was the third revolution, and that's I almost put a stop to that. It was in 1945. I was working for the British Air Force. Francis Crick, who afterwards discovered the double helix, was working for the British Navy. And we met and were talking about our plans for what we'll do after the war. Both of us were trained as physicists, and I was intending to go back into physics, and he was very, very depressed and miserable. He'd been working for the Navy for 6 years. The war hit him at a terrible time when he was just starting his career as a scientist. He was 5 years older than I was. And so I was 21 and he was 26. And so I thought of him as terribly old. And so I told him, no, he said to me that he'd forgotten everything he ever learned, so he'd have to make a fresh start. And he thought it might be just as well to start afresh as a biologist. rather than going back into physics. And I said that would be stupid, that biology was going to be more exciting in the end, but not yet, and that it would take too long for him. He would be too old by the time biology really got exciting. But fortunately, he didn't take my advice. And anyway, so I want to talk just briefly about the biosphere genome, that we're now reaching the point where we can sequence everything on the planet. And that's, of course, it's mixed up with the fourth revolution, which is the computer revolution. But the fact is that sequencing of DNA and the synthesis of DNA, that's the reading and writing of genomes, is in fact increasing at about Moore's law, which is what the rate of increase of computer capabilities, which is a factor of 100 every decade. And so that's the rate of growth of computing, it's the rate of growth of memory, it's the rate of growth of genomes. It works out about a factor of 100 every decade. That's been followed very closely for the last 40 or 50 years. So it seems to be continuing without any particular, without slowing down as far as we can tell. So at the moment we have sequenced about 1,000 species, and there are about 10 million species still to go, but that's only 2 decades. If you multiply by 100 every decade, so it means we'll have the whole biosphere done in about 20 years. And that's what I call the biosphere genome, and I think that's a very important milestone. It means that we will have in our hands, in some sense, the power to create a new biosphere, to create life in any form we want, anywhere we want to. But you don't only have to have the genomes, you have to understand what they're doing. And there I come to the fourth revolution, which is computers, where you have, this was also just starting in 1945. The first electronic computer was the ENIAC, actually started in 46. And then the Princeton computer, which was the first computer with software, which was designed by von Neumann, the mathematician. And so I was right there watching him do it, and it was exciting. Von Neumann never understood the game. He was completely, absolutely wrong about his predictions. I mean, he imagined computers necessarily being huge and big and complicated and expensive. He thought they would belong to big institutions like government departments and big research labs. And he was asked, I think on one occasion in Congress, how many computers will the United States need? And he answered, 18. I don't know whether that's true, but anyway, if not, it's well invented. But anyway, I mean, that was his way of thinking. He thought of computers as just one of a kind, very, very scientifically interesting, but never cheap and never small. Of course, the thing went in the opposite direction. First you had personal computers, and then they got cheaper and cheaper and smaller and smaller and smarter, until they were toys for 3-year-olds, and that's where they've been ever since. And so that's why Moore's law took over, why they started to multiply, because the demand for them is essentially infinite, and they can be used for anything you like. So the consequence of that was a kind of a turning point that was reached in the year 2000, when, and I should mention that now I'm talking about computers. There is a book on the subject which just came out called The Information by Jim Glick, which is extremely good. I wrote a review of it for New York Review of Books, and so my head is full of it. It's and as he says, the turning point was reached around the year 2000, when it became cheaper to collect information than to understand it. And that's what is now called the information flood. That is, we're collecting information much, much faster than we can understand it. And that is, of course, increasing all the time. It's already a decade since 2000. So we were collecting information about 100 times as fast as we can understand it. And so what Glick is saying is that the purpose now of human activity, both in the sciences and in the arts, I mean, for all kinds of human endeavors, is to create islands of meaning in a sea of information. I like that very much. So that's what we have to do. You can't hope to understand everything. You have to create an island of place where you really do understand it deeply. That's what science is now mostly doing. And so my final proposal for the future of mankind, or the future of life, is something I call the chicken egg. It's the egg of a biosphere. So it's 20,000 living cells, each for a different species, and with appropriate hardware and software to go along to help it to function wherever it lands. And so a thing the size of a chicken egg actually has the information. The amount of information in the genome is amazingly small. It's about 1 microgram of DNA, and it's about 1 petabyte of information. A petabyte means a quadrillion bytes. And that's a very small database compared with something like Google or something, or even just an ordinary physics lab. They have bigger databases than that. But that's all you need. That's all the genomes actually have. And it's this marvelous capability of life to turn that information into living creatures. And the secret is, of course, that we're not determined by our genes. I proved that. In my family, we did a human cloning experiment with identical twin grandsons. And so they're Donald and George. And I remember very vividly when Donald was 6 years old, he came up to me one day and he said, "Why am I me?" Of course, the question was, why is he Donald and not George? And I couldn't answer. I don't know the answer. I mean, what is the difference? They have the identical genes. We know they have identical genes. We actually got them sequenced by 23andMe, this commercial company. And they really are identical genes, but they're not the same people. So the fact is that the randomness is in their brains is not controlled by the genes. And that's why humans are creative. So anyway, that's the beginning of a long story, and I won't go on because that's where I should stop. So what I see in the end is there will come a time, not very long ahead, when we not only can collect 1 petabyte of data, that's already only a matter of another 20 years to collect the genomes, but actually to understand them, to understand how they function, what kind of creatures they produce, what sort of ecology results, to understand in depth the whole biosphere that we're creating. And then you go to some interesting place, like Enceladus, say one of the satellites of Saturn, or one of the asteroids, or a nice little home base somewhere out in the Kuiper Belt where the comets live. And so you design your biosphere for where it's going to go, and then you send it off. It takes only a small spacecraft. And then you can really become creative and produce any sorts of creatures you want. And then you can also make a habitat where humans can go and feel at home. So you manage to avoid the horrible problems that arise if you try to do that on this planet. If you try to make new biospheres on this planet, you're going to have trouble. And as nature, of course, did it very well. And trying to improve on nature here is asking for trouble, so I wouldn't advocate that. Anyway, time for questions.
wonderful talk with spawned about 18 billion questions just with me alone. The gentleman in the back. And please wait, there's someone who's going to give you a microphone.
May I ask you a question from your original profession in astrophysics? You believe that God created evolution law and our unique planet, like was in cosmological of Lemaitre, that life is really a unique situation in steady state expansion of the universe. He made some proof in small books like this. And the second part of this question, why we can't find more planets with life similar to our, and of course, last question, what do you think about this new elementary particle found in Tevatron, which will be revolutionize physics, this heavenly particle? Thank you.
Yeah, well, I'm skeptical about all three items, but no, I would say we're only at the beginning of exploring the universe. We're also only at the beginning of exploring God, and we're only at the beginning of exploring particles. So I've really, I've no information on any of those subjects.
The gentleman over here. Hold on just 1 second.
Thank you very much, Professor Dyson. Thank you for your passionate lecture. Appreciate it. I recently come across a very interesting article about the Dawkins that you mentioned in the interview. You said he's doing a lot of damage, and can you tell us why you said this statement?
Yes, because Dawkins is saying to young people that you have to be an atheist if you want to be a scientist. Well, there's lots of young people who do not want to be atheists, who still would like to be scientists, and he's just turning them off. So I think that's extremely harmful.
The gentleman over here, and right here. Yeah.
Dr. Dyson, can you address the controversy surrounding your views on global warming? And assuming that global warming is not primarily caused by man, but instead by nature, don't you feel nevertheless that something needs to be done to prevent impending catastrophe, flooding, and so on and so forth?
Well, that's a huge question. I would say, first of all, I mean, I think we know very little about climate. And so it's not a question of knowing what to do and then deciding not to do it. The problem is we don't know what makes sense to do. So none of the remedies that have been proposed really address the problem. The remedies are based on sort of dogmas which I don't think are proved at all. And so I would say we have to learn more before deciding what makes sense.
Yes.
Thank you so
Hold
much.
on. Wait for the microphone just for a second.
What are your thoughts about the radiation coming from Japan and how it's affecting the whole world? And is it, radiation is supposed to be in our soil and the air and the water? And do you have any thoughts on that? Are you afraid? What should we be thinking about?
Yes, the answer is do not be afraid. The remarkable thing about radiation is that it's detectable in tiny, tiny, tiny amounts, so that you can detect the radiation from bomb tests 50 years ago. It's still there, and in fact, it's quite a large component of the natural background, and it's just so easily detectable. Therefore, everybody concentrates their attention on that. There are far worse things going on that we cannot detect, which nobody worries about. And I find it tragic in a way that all the television coverage of the disasters in Japan, they concentrate entirely on the nuclear reactors, and they say almost nothing about the tsunami. It was the tsunami that killed 20,000 people, not the reactors. The tsunamis killed 20,000 people, and the Japanese have done an amazing job pulling the society together and starting the recovery. That's never mentioned compared with this coverage of the radiation, which has not killed anybody, and it's certainly a great nuisance, but it's far less of a problem than the tsunami itself.
This gentleman and then that young lady.
Dr. Dyson, isn't it true, by the way, that there is maternal DNA which you're overlooking in the story of your two twin grandchildren, and that differs between both, each of the twins differs between them, right? And secondly, could I ask, did you ever use your scientific knowledge and perceptions and intuition about the future to invest, and were you successful?
So the answer is, I invested in grandchildren and not in stocks and shares, but and I think it paid off. But and as to the first question, I didn't even know that there was any difference in maternal DNA. I'd have to check that. I wasn't aware of that.
I'm just curious. I'm just learning now myself about what is needed to maintain the safety or moderate safety of any nuclear reactor out there. It not only has to be monitored to make sure it's working properly day to day, but so that the actual machinery doesn't rust or break down or wear and tear over time, which is a real issue over because it's going to last hypothetically for an extremely long period of time. And I was just wondering if the reactors you worked on 40 some odd years ago had that built into the scheme, as well as the worst case scenario if it were to explode, and if you have any advice as far as the building of nuclear reactors and to the safety of maintaining them over a long period of time, as well as in the present moment.
No, I wouldn't try to advise anybody now. So I've been out of the business for about 50 years, but what I know for sure is that the fatal mistake which the industry made when they started building power reactors was to build submarine reactors. That the whole industry was started by Admiral Rickover building reactors for submarines for the United States Navy. And these reactors were wonderful for driving submarines. What you need, of course, if you want to be in a submarine is to be compact. So that he made them as compact as possible, which meant very high density of power. Power per cubic meter is extremely high. And that's exactly what you don't want for safety. So if you wanted to build safe reactors, we should have built reactors with very low power density, which you can easily do. Just make big concrete and graphite cores with a low power density. Then the whole problems become very much easier. But unfortunately, the momentum of Rickover's project was so strong, everybody slipped into his way of doing things. So all the existing reactors almost all over the world have followed that pattern. They just have this extremely high power density. That's what makes them so dangerous.
We'll take just two more questions because Professor Dyson has a long way to travel. This young lady and that young lady.
Safe voyage home. And do you have any good Feynman stories?
Feynman stories.
Oh, well, I don't think of one off the cuff. But, well, I mean, all of them have been published anyway. So.
May I tell you one story that Professor Dyson told me when I interviewed him many years ago? I asked him, of all the significant scientists with whom he worked, who did he believe had the real seed of genius? And he answered Feynman.
Yeah, that's correct. But But of course, he was also a great joker. But I don't think of any jokes at the moment, except for the ones which everybody's heard. And
none played on you.
Sorry.
The other young person back there, the young lady.
Mr. Dyson, you mentioned earlier that the reactors built here in the U.S. are safe. How safe are they? Like, let's say that we will have a calamity coming, God forbid, over us, something like type Japan. How safe these reactors would be? Would they withstand an earthquake or a calamity of that proportion?
No, there's not nothing that would be like the Japanese experience, because they don't significantly continue putting out energy after you switch them off. The problem in Japan was the afterheating. After the reactors were shut down, they continued to produce a lot of power. That's the result of this high power density. So our reactor was a much lower power density, so that would not be a problem.
Thank you for a wonderful talk. And now Professor Dyson has agreed to sit for a few minutes in the back and sign books to anyone who would like to purchase them. And there are refreshments for the rest of you. Come.